We will have the conversations that few are prepared to have, and more importantly, conversations centered on rationality. Subscribe now to listen to Rational Voices with Sunil. Maya, amazing to have you here today. How has life been since the Supreme Court hearing? We've been a couple of weeks now since the ruling. How's your life been since then?
Hectic, a bit up and down. I mean, we didn't know what the judgment was going to be, and we did a sort of scale of 1 to 10. This is the judgment on what is a woman in the Equality Act, and I think the judgment was 11 out of 10. It was kind of better than anything that we'd game planned. It was just really, really clear, and went through the whole of the Equality Act and left nothing to doubt. So, the sort of day after, we were overjoyed. And then a few days after, there was a crash because we had this perfect judgment, and institutions were not responding to it in the way that you would think they would when they had a judgment from the Supreme Court. And it's been, up and down since then, with some organisations getting in line, others defying the law.
It's be really interesting to hear about those institutions enough because we had Helen Joyce on a day after the ruling, and I was very much saying, "Oh, amazing news! This is like maybe coming towards the end of this sort of nonsense I've put up with the last few years." And Helen Joyce was a bit more reserved in a sense of saying that, yes, we've won this, but there are still ways in which we've got to make sure that people abide by the law, and that may be a lot more challenging than it sounds. And it was really fascinating. It would be really fascinating to understand from you what's happened since. But before we go down that road, if you like, how did you get involved in all of this? A lot of people will know who you are, some won't. How did you get involved in this whole?
So, like quite a lot of people in the UK, I kind of woke up to this issue of sex and gender in 2018 when the UK government was doing a consultation on whether it should reform the Gender Recognition Act and make it much easier for people to change their legal sex or their sex on their apparently on their birth certificates. And I was working at a think tank on international development and tax, nothing to do with this issue. And I just saw it, and I saw women like Kathleen Stock, like Helen Joyce, in fact, saying, perfectly reasonable things, which I thought, well, this is a policy topic. This is something that we should be able to talk about. There are clearly views on different sides, and women were getting attacked and losing their jobs, and meetings were being picketed and so on. And I just thought, well, this is very strange. And so I thought, well, I work at a think tank. I ought to be allowed to think. And I tweeted about it, and quite quickly I lost my job. And then I ended up becoming the test case for belief discrimination on the belief that sex is real, immutable, and important. That was in 2019. I lost the first round of that, and when the day after I lost was the first day that J.K. Rowling came into this debate. She tweeted about my case, which then sort of sent it stratospheric. And the case ultimately took 4 years, and I won. And so I created the precedent that you shouldn't be discriminated against because of this belief. I mean, it's a bit strange that reality is a belief, but that was the way to win the case. And in the course of that, I then set up Sex Matters, which is a human rights charity campaigning for clarity on sex in law and policy in the UK.
Right. Well, I can't. The sacking is like absolutely crazy. What did you think happened going back to 2018, 2019 when they did decide to dismiss it? First of all, when you made those comments or when you made those beliefs, did you have any idea that this could result in you losing your job?
Um, I mean, I knew it was, toxic, as they say, and difficult, but it was quite a small organisation, and it was an organisation that doesn't take institutional positions, and it was an economic development organisation, so it was full of economists, kind of hard-nosed people, who like to argue about stuff, and I just thought, there'll be people who disagree with me and people who agree with me, and this is a part of the culture of this place, and I'm sure it'll be fine. Um, the headquarters is in the US. The main body of the organization is in the US in Washington, and I think I hadn't quite realized how this debate was going down there. Trump had Trump had just got in for the first round. People were going a bit crazy about that, and I just sort of assumed that people would be more grown up about it than they were, and they didn't know about employment rights basically. So they thought I wasn't sort of a permanent employee. I was a consultant, but I was also a visiting fellow. And so they just assumed they could get rid of me. I didn't know I had any employment rights. It was only after I lost my job and I tweeted that I discovered there were some feminist lawyers who were thinking about the idea of a belief discrimination case. So it all kind of happened. um, it was a surprise to me. I think it was a surprise to them, that they ended up being the test case. And it was 8 days between when I lost my job and tweeted about it to when we filed the claim, which is quick. And then my life kind of changed from that point. It became, increasingly public.
Is this what you now do full time in terms of running Sex Matters and stuff? This is your only group.
Yeah, I'm the CEO of Sex Matters. We're a registered charity. I have board of trustees that keeps me in line, and we have small staff, so we're a small organisation because this issue, um, it's important and it's not being dealt with really by the established organisations, the established think tanks, charities, universities that should be doing the thinking about this, and so we've had to start our own.
Yeah, prior to 2018, obviously this topic had been a bit in conversation, had been involved in some of the cultural stuff. Where did you have like strong opinions about it before, like before the
Um,
build up to it?
not really. I've tried to think back to sort of when I first became aware of the issue, um, and I can think about, when I was at university, there was a professor who was transgender, and I remember him, being in the pub and sort of knowing who he was, and not thinking he was a woman, just thinking, well, he's an adult. Adults do strange things, like people do things. That's cool, but I didn't think he was a woman. Um, and I remember at that time, I used to hang out with the art students, and I remember having a conversation with one of the art students, and I said something about a transvestite, and she said, "Oh no, we don't say transvestite anymore. We say transgender." And I was like, "Well, do we?" And and I said, "Why?" And she said, "Well, transvestite makes it sound like it's just about the clothes." And I thought, well, isn't it? And I just that kind of sticks in my mind because I remember that conversation. I remember sort of being told off for, using the wrong words, and I think I just filed it as all right. Then I won't use the wrong words, and then I didn't really think about it again for quite a long time. But one thing I did do was, I'm a mum. I've got two sons, and uh, I was on Mumsnet, and I became involved in starting a campaign called Let Toys Be Toys, when my kids were quite a lot smaller, just from being annoyed being in toy shops. And, toy shops are very pink and blue coded, and all the girls are directed towards, toy ironing boards and cooking and pink stuff and sprinkles, and the boys are directed towards the construction toys, and much more than when I was a kid. And so we set up this little campaign on Mumsnet with a group of us who hadn't met each other, kind of started a Twitter account, and um, it blew up. And within 24 hours, we got a call from the BBC saying, "Would you come to be interviewed?" And so there were six of us in the campaign, and everyone went, "Who's going to do it?" And I went, "All right, I will." So they haven't had me back on BBC Breakfast since then, but I started this little campaign, went on BBC Breakfast. Maybe there was something in there about being brave, but also something about thinking about sort of sex and gender in society, I suppose.
What's the toys? I think I missed it. What the toys? You wanted a more wider range of
Let
toys?
toys be toys. So basically, putting pressure on retailers to say, stop marketing toys in such a sexist way, basically. Don't, I mean, sell the same toys, but don't have an aisle that says girls and an aisle that says boys. Have an
Right.
aisle that says, make believe, and an aisle that says construction, and let the children play in both of them. Um, and that was the campaign. And I remember when we were starting it, we were thinking about the name for the campaign, and we said it was "Let Toys Be Toys for Girls and Boys." And somebody wrote to us and said, "Oh, but some children are not girls and boys." And we were like, "Are they?" But we did we did drop that second bit of the campaign strapline. It ended up just being "Let Toys Be Toys." And it's still going on. The campaign's still going on. I sort of moved away from it because my kids got older. I spent less time being annoyed in toy shops, and it's interesting. I think some of the people who are involved in it are on the kind of gender critical side, and some are on the more genderist side. The idea of kind of challenging gender norms can go in both directions.
Well, the thing with the toys, actually the first when I launched this podcast, the first person I had was Miriam Grossman, who you may
Oh
be
yeah.
aware of, and she talks. She was one of the first people who really uh, got me thinking about gender. I was blissfully unaware and up until the last maybe a few years, and she really opened my eyes in terms of what was going on in terms of education and the upbringing, the lies that have been almost pushed through universities and education. And one thing she talks about is toys and how it's important to allow there to be different types of girls and different types of boys. Just because a boy is a bit more sensitive or likes pink doesn't mean he should now, as a child, decide to have change his body. The same for a girl. If a girl likes football or likes more building stuff, that doesn't mean she's not a girl. And she was very critical of, similar to what seems like the Let the Toys Be Toys campaign. She was very critical of pigeon boxing children into these boxes, and she thinks this in some ways what led to some of them being wrongfully pushed down the path of changing their gender. So I can see why. Oh,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's partly true, but also, I mean, boys and girls are different, and if you bring them up in a completely gender neutral way, they still will end up being different.
very
But
true.
what you don't want to do is push them into those boxes and make those boxes so constraining that you limit the choices about things they can be interested in.
So after the toys campaign, I'm guessing at this point you talked about the change in title. Were you now were you now becoming a bit more aware of what was going on in terms of the gender
N-
stuff?
No, not really. I mean, I was working on international tax. I got the job at the Centre for Global Development by picking apart one of their arguments about international tax and sort of showing why they were wrong about something. So, I'm argumentative, but on a completely different topic. And I was quite focused on that. That's what I wanted to be working on. I was raising money with them to do a project. I was sort of speaking at the World Bank and going to UN conferences and, doing all that kind of thing. And then this sort of out of the corner of my eye, really, I just caught sight of the sex and gender wars, and I was on Mumsnet. I sort of went back to Mumsnet because that's been. I saw it on Twitter, and I didn't really understand it. I didn't understand why people were being so horrible to each other, and was I a bigot? I think everyone should be included, but I also think there's a difference between men and women. And suddenly this view that seemed perfectly normal to me was unacceptable. So I went back to Mumsnet because it's a site of great wiseness. And sort of read stuff for about a year on Twitter, on Mumsnet, to try and figure out what I thought about this subject. And then when I did, I started tweeting about it and very quickly lost my job, or kind of started the process of losing my job. It took about 6 months, but I was investigated, and they looked at all my tweets and yeah, basically said I was a Nazi.
Absolute horrible experience, and like it's awful experience. And I think like one of the things, and I had this chat with Helen. I find it really frustrating, and I think what your story kind of sheds light to why people don't do this. But I was saying to Helen, I find it really frustrating how there's so many people I know or just generally who 100% agree with everything you're saying, I'm saying, but will never ever dare to say it publicly, and will never say that amongst peers or anywhere. And I find it really frustrating because I'm always like, if you don't say it, then you're enabling the actions of the other side, and it's a really basic thing to say, but you're speaking to yourself and other people who have decided to speak out so publicly and so early on, the effects are can be fairly traumatizing. Obviously, you've gone on to amazing things since, but for a lot of people, they may have not had the braveness to do it, and the ones that did to then turn it in, to carry on going with it would be
Hmm.
a lot more difficult. Do you empathize with people in that spectrum of not who don't speak out about this, especially people in maybe jobs, corporate jobs, or do you feel almost a bit frustrated that not enough people are calling out the absurdity?
I think, I mean, like you say, this blows up your life, and people have other things in their life. And there are lots of things that I don't speak about. There are lots of topics that, I just go, well, someone else can fight that battle. And so I think that's quite understandable. And people have mortgages and kids and lives and all kinds of reasons not to blow up their world. And also that the thing that they're doing is important. Maybe they're doing medical research, or maybe they're running a women's refuge or something, and they just think, if I step into this, then the good that I'm doing is going to be completely blown off course. But I think there are sectors um, that didn't speak about this that are particularly important. And I mean, it's interesting. People, I think, feel the most aggrieved about the sector that's closest to them. So Helen, feels very aggrieved about journalism. That journalism, to a large extent, didn't speak up enough about this. Didn't look into it enough. They're doing a lot more now, um, and I kind of feel the same about the NGO sector, the charity sector, the human rights organisations, because this has been done in the name of human rights. And human rights is a framework that allows you to balance. It recognises that people have different interests, and that the human rights framework is all about balancing different interests. Um, and they either completely looked away and just said it's toxic, we're not going to talk about this, we're doing something else, or they sort of said trans rights are human rights, and left it at that, and sort of repeated these mantras and didn't apply their particular discipline to solving this problem. And this happened across all kinds of different important places. So, for example, the census, the ONS, that runs the census and that runs statistics, the quality of statistics across all of the UK, um, should have said, well, it matters when you collect data whether people are male or female. That's something that matters. And that doesn't undermine their identity or undermine their self-expression or want to make them feel unsafe or any of those things. But we need to know what's happening to men and women in the economy, in medicine, everywhere. Because if you don't, then you end up forgetting about women. I mean, there are lots of people whose whole thing is saying, don't forget about women. And yet when it came to this, they went, oh, well, maybe you can forget about them now. So there are specific areas where I think, well, why didn't the statisticians speak up about data? Why didn't the human rights people apply the human rights framework? Why didn't the journalists investigate? And so on. And why didn't the think tanks and universities hold open a space for people to have different views about this? Um, because I think this has done damage to, I mean, it's done damage to individual people. It's done damage to, particularly the young people who have bought into the idea of being born in the wrong body and taken hormones and become separated from their families and missed out years and years of development, adolescent development. It's harmed those people. It's harmed the women and men who've spoken up about it. But it's really, really harmed institutions. It's harmed their ability to do their job, and that's really important, even if you don't care about women. Um, you know, like a lot of people have looked at this and thought, oh, it's only women, it's only women's sports, it's only lesbians, and they've not thought this is important. I mean, all those things are important, but so are the institutions that run society, and they've been kind of hollowed out from the inside out, not only by this ideology, but this ideology is particularly pernicious because it puts a fundamental untruth in the heart of institutions.
Why do you think institutions didn't speak out or do the appropriate research or do it? Because it doesn't take somebody with incredible gender biological knowledge to know what's between right and wrong in this instance. So why did these institutions just you know almost not even, I wouldn't say blissfully avoid it. Some of them really doubled down. Some of them really would have labeled people like yourself bigots and gone even like more than just blindly following what's going on. They've almost doubled down and they've put themselves really in that camp. Why did they not sit there and think to do their own research and work it out?
I think I think just all the incentives were going the wrong way, and they were going the wrong way, um, not because of sex and gender, but the institutions were vulnerable. They were legacy institutions with um, money and power and status, and particular ways of organizing, and ways of organizing that were supposed to be meritocratic, that were supposed to be seeking truth and doing whatever their job is. Um, but those institutions are also vulnerable to people gaming the system, and to bad ideas just taking hold. I mean, I think people often ask, why did this happen? And I've kind of thought, is there a sort of white cat stroking evil genius somewhere who came up with this thing, or is there a cabal of people who are driving it? And I don't think it was that. I think it's just a very bad idea, but a very catchy idea, and it sort of won through meme warfare, and it took over institutions that had sort of lost their bite, I think, lost their way a bit, and were vulnerable to it. And so sort of big organizations have systems for for making things work. Like you have the system of safeguarding through any institution that looks after children, vulnerable people, so education, healthcare. And the system of safeguarding has been developed because of years and years of child abuse scandals, of abuse of vulnerable people, that just the recognition that institutions can harbor bad people if you don't be very, very careful. And so they built up all of these structures for safeguarding about writing things down, doing risk assessment, professional curiosity, and so on. But if you put a lie into the heart of that, those systems start working against what they're supposed to be doing. So you end up with, parents who want to protect their children from gender medicine being reported to social services and being threatened to have their children taken away from them, rather than the people who are promoting medicine that's well, it's not medicine, but drugs that sterilize children and sell them on a lie that is an impossible lie that will make them unhappy. Um, so all of these kind of big systems that have been built into organizations to make them do the right thing ended up being turned on their head 180 degrees because they were trying to protect a lie, the lie that men can be women and women can be men. And so if you have these systems that are supposed to be robust, be accurate, protect people, and then you also try and protect a lie, you end up making all of those systems work against themselves.
And I think for a lot of people, it's also attractive to then join that system. If I come out and say, or in my organization, start to wear the badge that men can be women and all this sort of stuff, then I know for a fact I would get ample amount of support from the organization, from people around me. If I then identify it in that category, I'll get even more support and even more attention. So then I think it's very hard to then maybe say the other opinion. Is there an institution that you look at and you think not are most responsible, but have had the worst impact on the gender stuff? Is there an institution that you think, particularly in the UK, that's had a really terrible impact on this?
Um, I mean, the one that's sort of disappointed me or over and over again has been the civil service. Um, the it sort of gives the impression of being um, a very robust, established, has all these principles and working processes, and then you poke it a little bit, and you'd think somebody in these government systems would be saying, hold on a second, if we pretend that some boys are girls and some girls are boys in school, we're going to be putting them in danger. We're going to be you know just putting them in dangerous situations, and we're going to be and then if we tell them that if other people recognize what your sex is, they hate you and they're going to cause harm to you, then we're pulling those children out of their community, their family, out of all of the things that we should be protecting them in. I mean, it's just obvious, and yet you've got the whole bureaucracy of the Department for Education, and no one's saying this. Um, you have Girl Guides, for example, the you know ages old, all girls organization takes, it's a really important organization, takes a lot of girls away for their first trip away from their family, camping, uh, independence, adventure, um, and it's all girls. And yet they allow men who identify as women to be leaders and boys who identify as girls to come in as girl guides and brownies. But they tell the parents still it's all female, and all of the safeguarding is still it's all female. And they will say to you, well, they're women. I've had conversations with them and I've said, no, well, they're men. Men and women are different. They have different risk profiles. And they said, no, they're women. Like the words matter, not the reality. And Girl Guides has a long history. It has, all kinds of structures. It's a charity. It's regulated. And all of these people who should have been responsible and should have said, hold on a second, this is mad. You don't put boys in girls' tents. You don't put men into organizations that are, that are for women and girls and pretend that they're women. And also, the other thing that isn't immediately talked about is the fact that for a lot of men who want to dress up as women, there is an explicit sexual element in it. Um, it's which was partly that conversation that I had when I was at university when I said they're transvestites, and I was told, oh no, they're transgender, and the underlying thing of that conversation was transvestite was something that was recognized as being um, a fetish, whereas transgender makes it an identity. You'd never really talk about transvestite children, for example, but now you can talk about transgender children. It's taken this thing that was well known to be something that some men did, and in your adult life, something that some people do is fine, but don't bring it to work. um, and all of that, which was very well known. If you talk to any police officer of kind of older age, they know the score. um, has become unspeakable, and so then you have organizations like Girl Guides saying, oh, they're women, it's fine, they're women.
Guys, man, that was, I think, actually the first thing that drew my attention in terms of how serious this gender stuff was. When I'd said it previously, I maybe really naively, I just presumed there was a lot of attention on swimming, and I remember
Mm,
Lyle Thomas that being the really big thing. And I remember I spoke about it a few times, but a lot of people would say to me, it's like it's a swimming competition, it's not the end of the world or whatever. And I maybe naively just thought, yeah, there's some truth behind that. But it was only when Girl Guides, when I realized, and I think I watched something on TV. There was a debate, and somebody was criticizing the Girl Guide CEO. He was wearing questionable things, and then they start talking about boys being able to go into this safe space for girls. That's when I realized this is actually a
mm,
seriously mainstream issue. when going back to the transvestite and transgender thing, do you do you think that some of this there is some like predatorial links to some of these profiles? I've really in the last maybe 6 to 7 months, I've been doing a lot more research, been speaking to a lot more people like yourself, and I'm not saying I'm coming to this conclusion, but some of me is starting to think that a lot, not everyone, of course, but there are elements to some of these people who are involved in this trans activism and the LGBTQ stuff that there's some elements of, I don't know, predatory nature because I've really struggled to wrap my head around it. But do you see signs of that?
Yeah, I think, it's hard um, to look at this for any length of time and not come to that conclusion. And I think that's part of the reason why we're not supposed to look at it and why so much effort is put into not allowing people to look at it, because I think it's very clear that that is um, part of what's going on. Um, and I mean, you would just, it's obvious, right? Like, men are responsible for 98% of sex crimes. Um, if you give a group of men um, a a kind of free pass to say we won't consider you as having sexual motives. You are a caste that's you're the sacred caste. Then any group like that is going to attract people with bad intentions. And we know this. That, this happened with scout leaders. It happened with priests. It happened with gymnastics coaches. And so there's that just kind of general thing, and then there's, as I said, that there is, this is a fetish, and fetishes come together. Um, and um, and then you're saying, and you have access to um, women's spaces. So it's definitely going to attract predators, and we've seen that. We've seen it over and over again. And you look at the um, data. There's not great data on any of this, but like the data of what are men who identify as trans women in prison for, of the population of men who identify as trans women in prison, um, about half of them are there for sex crimes, which is higher than the average for men and much, much higher than the average for women. Um, and then there are lots of people attached to this movement who are not necessarily trans identified themselves, but who are using this movement to shut down um, middle-aged women, because middle-aged women are generally the ones who will point and say there's a problem here. Young women often won't, because they um, they're just at the start of their career. They don't have the power to, it's tended to be older women. For example, when Jimmy Savile was abusing children in hospitals and children's homes across the UK, it was the older matrons, the senior nurses that were challenging this and getting shut down. And so that, for example, Surrey Pride has been the Pride organisation that has turned up in London a couple of times to protest outside LGB Alliance. I was thought, well, why is Surrey Pride the one that's turned up there to try and shut down, a group of gay people that have said that this ideology is damaging? And it turns out the head of Surrey Pride um, was a rapist, and he was put away. And in any um, any organization or any sector that allows itself to be overly, to put a cast of people outside of scrutiny, is going to attract bad people into that sector, into those opportunities. And that's what's happened.
And I think it's so disturbing because they've completely forgotten about the basic elements of safeguarding. You have safeguarding measures in place, whether it be in prisons, schools, to prevent it. Doesn't mean every man is going to be a rapist or every man is
Mm.
terrible. You're just safeguarding for the fact that we know, like you say, most of the sex crimes are done by males. So it probably makes sense not to have men in the same bathroom as women because we know that if the attack's going to happen, it's going to be the man. So it probably makes sense that they're not in the same vicinity for especially something private like that. And it just seems really bizarre that we're in 2025 in the last 10 years, and it definitely feels, I want to get your take actually on this, because it's been a reoccurring theme about how people feel that women rights have been damaged like crazy in the last 20, 30 years. And it'll be interesting to get your opinion on this, because you've studied this for a while and understand it a lot better than I would. Do you think women rights right now are, let's say, a lot worse than they were maybe 20, 30 years ago?
Um, I mean, structurally, they're they're kind of the same. I mean, we've just won this case, which was about sex discrimination, and that was the 2010 Equality Act. So that's 15 years. But it had basically what's in the 2010 Equality Act in relation to sex comes from the Sex Discrimination Act 1975. So that's as old as me, 50 years. And so those legal frameworks are quite well established. But then what's happened is that, if you can't say what a man is and what a woman is, then when those rights come into conflict, um, you can't stand up for women. And that's what's happened. And so, and I think um, a lot of men haven't seen this because the institutions that got captured first were the women's institutions, the women's organizations. So, for example, Fawcett Society, which is, it started with the suffragettes, very old women's rights organization in the UK, has said nothing yet about this judgment at all, and almost nothing about this topic for the past 5 or 6 years. And if they'd had the bravery to say anything sensible on it, almost none of this would have happened. Because if you have respectable organisations saying, well, there are rights on both sides. Let's talk about it. Women's rights need to be protected. The ability to have
Why would they
women's
not? Why
organisations
would
need
they
to be
not say
protected.
anything? Why would they, like, of all the people, like all the organizations, that surely would be the first place to can call
Yeah,
this out.
well, that's what you'd think, wouldn't you? And then when they don't, you think, well, it can't be happening, because if it was happening, they'd be saying something. But um, I mean, they're small organisations. They go where the money goes, and I think they looked at it at the beginning and they thought, this is toxic. We have other things to think about. Why would we throw our brand and our reputation, um, and our sort of mental health and whatever away on this? And they just try to give it a wide berth. And also, lots of organisations, they have a board who are older, um, who may be sensible, but are not putting very much time into it. And then they have staff who are much younger and who have been coming out of schools and universities, kind of pre-packed with these ideas. And you have a conflict between the board and the staff, and you don't have strong leadership, and so the organizations just get captured. And so it was the gay rights organizations, it was the women's organizations that got captured first, you know not mainstream. And then they weren't there as a protection.
Right. I mean, I think, we've discussed in terms of how where we are right now and up to the, if you like, the Supreme Court hearing ruling. A lot of people would have seen that news and been, super happy and thought this is coming towards the end of this absurdity, this craziness. We've had warnings on people on this podcast saying that may not be the case. What has happened since then? So it's been a few weeks now. What has happened? Has the United Kingdom accepted the Supreme Court ruling, and have all institutions accepted that only biological women are women?
Not quite. Um, they've dragged their feet. Today, the National Police Chiefs Council have issued new policy on searching, which was one of the downstream things of this. The question about, there's a law that says, if you're searched, as in strip searched by the police, you have to be searched by an officer of the same sex as you. But they'd said, well, that means their sex on paper, their sex with a gender recognition certificate. And we'd said, no, it means your actual sex, because we're talking about people's human rights here, not their self-expression. And they have been dragging their feet on this and arguing against us for the past 5 years on this, and today they withdrew that policy. So that's good news.
Amazing.
But they also they kept the policy. So there are two sides to this policy. One side is about a police officer with a gender recognition certificate. Can a male police officer search a woman? But the other side is, what if you have a suspect who says, I'm a woman? Does that person have the right to be searched by a female officer? And actually, this happens much more often because men, many more of the people who are detained and searched, and female officers are in the minority. And some people who are detained and searched are trans, and some are just chancers. And, if they can say, oh, I'm a woman, I've got to be searched by a woman, they will. And so they didn't withdraw that part of the policy. They're still saying, oh, if with consent, a detainee who says they're trans can be searched by a female officer.
Wow.
And those female officers, they're young, they're trying to get promotion, they have senior officers telling them what to do. It's very difficult for them to say, no, I won't do it. And if they say no, it just goes to another female officer. So, that's just one example of how it's fixed one place, but they've not fixed the other place yet. Um, we still have to go back with that argument about, well, those female police officers also have human rights.
That's so
Sex
much.
matters everywhere.
The other place is so much worse though, because the likelihood of a police officer doing wrongdoing is a lot less than somebody who's been a criminal getting arrested. The first thing I thought of is just first red flag is a man is drunk, getting arrested from a pub, and is saying he identifies as a female because he's seen a, a female there, and she has to search him.
Yeah, yeah,
Ah,
or
crazy.
yeah. And I mean, obviously, people who are being searched are vulnerable people, but some of them are also um, taking the piss, and
Yeah.
and you know, and some of them are sex offenders who say they're women, and the sex matters basically. And so we're starting to see, and the big fight has the first big fight after the judgment, everyone focused on toilets because that's the day one thing after you think, oh, okay, men are not women and women are not men, what do we do about our toilets? And that's not it's not rocket science, because most big buildings have a unisex option. And so if people don't want to use the toilet for the correct sex, there's somewhere else they can go. You're not always forcing people into a male or female box. There's another box, and that other box isn't a third sex. We're not asking any questions, unisex, um, but that's not what they want. What they want is to be able to use the opposite sex facilities. And because employers have, for the past 5 years, told their staff that this is the inclusive thing, and that if you disagree with it, you are a bigot and a transphobe, they now have to turn around and say, oh, actually, we got the law wrong. Um, we do have to um, we do have to have clear rules about toilets. And that, practically it's not difficult, but culturally it's a huge shift, because they've all been collecting awards and patting themselves on the back for being so inclusive, and they haven't been thinking about particularly about women, but about Muslim women, about Jewish women, about disabled women, just all kinds of women who would much prefer to have a clear single sex space when they're going to the toilet, when they're washing, when they're changing, when they're having a shower. That should have been obvious. It never should have been inclusive to try and push those boundaries. And so for all those organizations, having to turn around is turning out to be quite difficult. But I think they will do it. And we've just had draft guidance from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which is the regulator, setting out very clearly the practical implications of the judgment. And various toys have been thrown out of the pram because of that, and they're facing 3 claims for judicial review where people want to take them to court and say that what they've done is unlawful and a breach of human rights. Um, but it's very clear that that is what the Supreme Court said.
I mean, the toilet one's an interesting one because I know you mentioned Jewish women, disabled women, Muslim women. I've maybe I don't know enough people, but everyone I've spoken to, whether it's male, or female, wants their own space and their own toilets. I find it so uncomfortable. I know it's a big thing in London when you go to a toilet and it's more different gender. You just feel so unease and it just doesn't feel remotely even as the man. And I'm not even saying it's obviously a lot worse for the woman. I don't know many male or female people who think that they are happy with a unisex toilet. I'm certain if we did an anonymous survey and we went around the country, it'd be close to 99% of people would say they prefer to have that time by themselves. But you made a really good point, which I don't think we've covered it, or many people have covered, is about the cultural impact. Because so many people, as you rightly say, have won awards, have pushed this amongst their companies, amongst their corporations, and now they have to go back and say that this was all a lie. So what do you envisage happening there? Because I can imagine some people are going to really dig in their nails and really, to save their own. There's diversity officers, all these kind of not diversity. There's all the sort of there'll be jobs almost created for some of this keeping people inclusive who's maybe at risks, and so it would probably make sense for them to keep doubling down and keep going forward and pushing back as much as you can. So how do you combat those people? So that the people who are sitting there saying no, we're not going to abide by the rules and we've got it right all along. And then B, do you think like this, I don't know if program's the right word, but there's a way to almost get these corporations willingly to comply without it looking like egg on their face?
Mm. I, I think it's difficult. I mean, I think kind of cowardice will help us in some ways. They went with the herd in one direction and they'll go with the herd in the other direction once it starts moving. I think um, they need to put this back into the parts of the company that pay attention to compliance and to the bottom line. It needs to go back to the general counsel. It needs to go back to the health and safety people. I mean, toilets, it turns out toilets are a health and safety requirement. There's a whole suite of regulations about having safe workplaces, workplaces that don't kill people or make them injure them, and that includes windows and lighting and equipment and fire escapes and all those kinds of things, but it also includes toilets. There's specific regulations in there about toilets, about changing rooms and about showers, and it says that they must be single sex apart from when they're in a fully enclosed room, like your toilet at home kind of thing. But in any big workplace you're going to want to have male and female separate, and the signs on the doors are they're not just cute signs or preferences. They're like the signs that you have for a fire exit, and you have all kinds of rules about fire exits that say you don't just have the fire exit, you have to make sure that you don't stack a load of chairs in front of them, and that you do the fire alarm, the fire test, and you have people who are responsible for making sure that the door is unlockable and all of those kinds of things. And toilets is part of that regulatory scheme. And the people who are in charge of health and safety in an organization, they're not supposed to be popular people. They're not supposed to be, easygoing, or, they're supposed to be the kind of rules-based people who say, no, you really can't smoke in here. And organizations have safety cultures, and yet they've put this outside of the safety culture, and so they need to put it back into that culture. There are large parts of organizations where they're very used to saying no to people, and yet somehow on this they've gone, oh, we can't possibly say no to anybody. But they just need to move it back into the saying no part of the organization, because when I talk to CEOs and senior managers, they're kind of tearing their hair out about this because it's such a stupid subject. You
Yeah.
know, what they want to be doing is something else altogether, and that's what they should be doing. And yet they've got half their staff falling out with the other half of their staff, and having mental health crises over it, and thinking that people want them dead. And um, they shouldn't be doing any of that. They should just be saying, we have a men's toilet, we have a women's toilet, you have an unusual lifestyle, we can accommodate that insofar as it doesn't get in the way of you doing your job and getting along with your colleagues. And now let's get on with whatever it is we're doing, making movies or widgets or you know trains or whatever. um and that's what they should be doing. And I think lots of business leaders will feel quite relieved when they can get back to that. And leaders of value-based organizations, charities, have been torn apart over this. And so the more that they can get back to just saying, well, these are the rules, we're not going to negotiate, this is safety, the better.
I think the majority of companies will definitely be able to do that. I find it, what I find maybe a bit tough is some of the companies who have basically made this part of their like mission statement, and they've incorporated part of their culture, part of their boardroom meetings, part of their quarterly annual stuff. I've seen it before where people have discussions about what profiles of people that they've hired in this specifically in trans and all this sort of stuff. And so for those companies now who talk about it every other week or whatever on a regular basis, I think they're going to be in a bit more trouble. But I also don't have too much sympathy for them because it was an absurd thing to do in the first place, to do that over a lot of people I felt like who I'd spoken to didn't really understand it and still decided to go so heavy. You see it in particular in like Hollywood, for example, of how much that culture has just completely absorbed it to the point I don't think many, or if any, actors or actresses can really speak against it. And naturally, if you're on Netflix and these streaming platforms, and the message would be that what you're saying, what I'm saying is really negative, and that the Nazi claim would start coming out very quickly.
Mm.
Do you see that changing? Do you see more? And I suppose aside from J.K. Rowling, that's the one that we all know. Do you know? Are you seeing any other big names or big? It doesn't necessarily celebrities who are coming out more on the women are women approach.
Um, Very few. I mean, arts, I think, has been one of the most captured sectors. And it's a winner takes all sector where there are very few people with um, secure jobs, and so things like employment protections don't really work because everyone's freelance, and people have been cancelled so viciously, and I think that that's still very true. So I don't think this we're going to be led out of this um, by the arts. And also there's a big um, demographic uh, pattern with young people are much more um, willing to say that sex is a spectrum, gender is what you feel. People who say that sex is real are bigots, and also to say, and I don't need single sex spaces. What's all the fuss about? Can't we just be kind? That message is much more um, common in young people, and so we have these kind of two different things going on. One, we have the compliance, and now the law is clear, and we have kind of grown up institutions recognizing that this will um, hit their bottom line if they don't if they don't comply with the law, because they're going to be sued, and they're going to um, lose in tribunals and in court cases. And also that it just becomes safer for them to say, oh, this is the law, we need to comply with the law and get on with our business. But then schools, young people, and young people coming through university, it's a different story. They are much more committed to this idea, um, and and that then shapes the institutions that they're going into. So I think those are the two kind of forces we have pulling in different directions.
How do you combat that? Because that seems like a really, really challenging thing to say. I would have said even when I went to university, it would have been tough to have some of these discussions, but I feel like now it'd be like suicide. It'd be crazy to
Yeah.
stand up and do that. So
It
how do you challenge that?
it it's the it's a really hard one. And when I talk to young people who say to me, this is who agree with me, and say this is crazy, but I don't say to them, blow up your career before it started. I mean, they're not in a position to be able to do that. And they need to get through university and get their degree and get a job and not blow up their lives. So that's really difficult, and I think it is for the grown-ups to solve a lot of this, particularly because young women, you kind of think you're invincible as a young person, and as a young woman, you think the world is a lot more equal than it really is. And it's often not until um, you go and have kids of your own that you realize, oh, this man woman thing, it hasn't gone away. But by that time, it's kind of too late because you're knee deep in nappies. Um, and so you have this kind of cohort effect with young women where the um, young women kind of coming through university and into work think that all the problems are solved, and the older women have, they're wiser, um, but some of them have left the workforce, or they're in that kind of sandwich thing of keeping their elder parents and their younger children, keeping households going. Um, and so you learn as you get older, but the learning doesn't trickle down. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think one thing we are seeing, I think, at least, uh, I mean, I don't have hard data on this, but the next generation coming up is thinking this is all a bit naff.
Mm.
So you've got the generation that's come through and that's imbibed all this and that's all rainbows and glitter, and then you've got the generation below them that's looking at their slightly older peers and thinking, you know, this is idiotic. I mean, they'll probably come up with something else of their own that's even more idiotic, but it won't be this one. Um, so there's a sense at which it's a trend, and trends blow through. So that may also happen.
I hope you're right there because I think so. I'm 31, and I think I come under millennials still, and I think it is the millennials who are being the biggest problems
Mm,
with this whole. I think I don't know the exact age gap, but I think millennials have definitely been the bigger problem with this, and there is lots of the younger generation who are looking at this thinking, yeah, this is crazy. I think the concern I think maybe I have, I don't have children, but so I can't really make I don't know what I'd do in this position, but
mm,
my concern is the people who have children who are in the teenage children, let's say, and who have been sold this gender stuff. They hear about it at school, teachers, lecturers, wherever, and then they say it to their parents, and then their parents become a bit more softer about it because their children are either going through it or they know somebody going through it, blah blah. And I've definitely seen that happen where I've been really surprised at some people who I know of or know of parents who have never presumed 10 years ago to have that kind of opinion, but because they're raising teenagers and young females and young men, that their views now also changed because they don't want to be left behind. What they would may say what our views are as outdated or whatever, but they don't want to be left behind. So is that something you've seen as well in
yeah, definitely. I mean, I've seen sort of both the extreme end of that and the milder end, which you talk about. So the extreme end of it, I think, has been the parents who have transitioned their children, or their children have transitioned and the parents have supported it, who then become very extreme cheerleaders for this movement and can't hear anything against it, because if if you were to tell them that, if they were to think that what they have done is allow their child to be sterilized, to lose adult sexual function, to lose the chance of a family life, I think they would be devastated. And what they've sold themselves is the idea that um, this is their child's true self. But also, they've been driven by fear. They've been told that if you don't do this, your child will commit suicide, or very real, if you don't do this, your child will not talk to you again. Your child will leave you. And so there are a lot of those people in show business and in the top of institutions, and in the civil service. I mean, not lots and lots, but enough to have a very significant impact, because just one person high up in a department who has transitioned their child um, is enough to make that whole department not talk sensibly about this. So, for example, the information commissioner, so the body that's supposed to regulate data protection and accurate data, his child is trans. He's written about this. He's been public about it. He's been very public about um, being supportive of the whole thing. And so, how can anyone in the Information Commission say, hold on a second, data accuracy matters? So there's that group. And then, like you say, there's the other group who, it's their child's friendship group. There's someone in their child's friendship group who's non-binary or, trans identified. That child may or may not go on to sort of seriously transition, but you don't want to be unpopular. You don't want to make your child the unpopular one. You're not responsible for that other child's happiness and the decision that their parents make, and so you just kind of go along with it. And I can quite understand that, as a parent. I mean, my kids sort of miss this a bit. They're a little bit older, but yeah, you don't fight every battle.
Well, you talk about the information commissioner. I saw, um, I'm not sure the exact role of this person, but at Disney, there is somebody in the board level who has a transitioned kid and one kid who's non-binary, and it's like those odds are more than 1 in 2 million to have two in that circumstance. So there is in my head, I do sometimes think, I don't know if they're using the kids as props or it's some sort of weird kind of thing. But again, within Disney, if you've got somebody in the board level who has two examples of it, are you really going to then sit there and say, "Oh no, we should stop using pronouns. We should stop. Women are just women."
Mm,
You're probably not going to, because you're going to offend that person who's an example of it, and you'll probably rather just push it to the side. And that's where if you watch any of the Disney news stuff or whatever, it's full of these sometimes subtle, sometimes really obvious gender stuff. So I think it's really hard. I think if you're in that position, whether you're working for somebody or got friends, to then speak up about it. But again, to me, it just seems crazy that this is such a contentious thing that we're discussing. Has that ever crossed your mind, like in terms of what you've obviously done amazing stuff in the last 6, 7 years in regarding this. Does it cross your mind to think that some of the battles you're having, where you're just like, this is crazy, considering the career you've had, like you've dealt with really serious,
mm.
complex international tax stuff, and now you're almost battling just to say women are women and men are men. Like, does that cross your mind?
Yeah, it's the stupidest thing. I mean, and I think that's why, we should win in the end, hopefully soon, because reality is reality, and you know, women keep having babies, people are born from sperm and eggs. That it's so fundamental, and it's so basic. It's crazy that we're having to fight this battle to just to be able to speak about reality. And I had to bring this legal case to say that this is a belief, and it is a belief. It's important that people are able to talk about it, and it's important that people do talk about it. It's not just science; it's also society. But it's so, yeah, it's so stupid to be having to get up every morning and make the argument that there are men and there are women, when everyone can see that, and cats and dogs can see it, and we're just hardwired to see it.
What's next for yourself and Sex Matters? Like, what's the journey now? Like you said, there are people who are not going against the ruling. What is your next plans to have a going forward as an organization, just maybe personally?
Well, one of the big battles that we're fighting at the moment is about data. So we've got this bill going through at the moment, the data bill, and um, it's one of the things that it's doing is setting up a system of digital verification. So um, digital identity, not a kind of standard identity card or a universal system, but a way of making enabling people to prove facts about themselves. So, like when you go to open a bank account, you're probably too young to have experienced this, but sometimes you go to do something and they say, can you bring your passport and two
Yeah.
bills,
Yeah.
and you go, what do you mean two bills? I don't have any bills. They all, that doesn't exist anymore. That's been how you prove your identity in the UK, because we don't have an identity card system. And so on the top of that, they're trying to build a system to enable people to more easily prove who they are online and using apps, and to show that you're over 18 when you go to the pub and that kind of thing, without revealing other information about yourself. And that would it would go a long way to solving um, the kind of sex and gender problem, because the human right that trans people have is a privacy right. It's the right not to have to reveal your sex or have your sex recorded, or um, have somebody ask you your sex when they don't need it. So when you're going to open a bank account or get insurance or use a unisex toilet, it's the right to say none of your business. But the problem is with analog identities, things like driving licenses, passports, birth certificates, you have to show your sex because it's on the analog piece of paper. I mean, it's a kind of trivial thing, because if you meet someone face to face, you can almost always tell what sex they are, even if they've gone quite a long way to hide it. But part of the problem that caused all of this in society and in the state was that they decided to try and help people to sort of blend into the opposite sex by allowing them to change their identity documents. So they allowed people to change their passports, and this wasn't done through Parliament. There was no law passed. It was just done as a sort of accommodation in the 1960s. And the decision to do it is lost in the midst of time. But now we're in a situation where we're trying to implement the law and to communicate clear rules, and people are saying, well, how do you know what sex somebody is? Are you going to inspect my genitals? All my documents say female. And so the ability to use data as the sort of conflict breaker, and the way of having kind of clear concepts and categories, has been lost, because there is no official record of what, or easily available official record of what sex people are. And so one of the things that we're fighting is in this digital verification system. So the new generation of digital identity, you could solve this problem. You could say, if you don't want to reveal your sex when you're proving that you're over 18 in the pub, you don't have to. But if you're registering to join a gym, then you probably do. I mean, maybe not
Right.
every gym, but if a gym has male and female changing rooms, they're going to want to know what sex you are. If your answer is mind your own business, that may be fine. If they have a unisex changing room, then they can say, well, you can use the mind your own business changing rooms.
Right.
So it's kind of matching data and spaces and making it much less about individual conflicts and individual people fighting out these battles, and much more about just having a clear answer that then lets people get on with their life.
What's the pushback to this? Has there been any pushback? Because I can't. The only pushback I can think is the general digital ID. Some people aren't for general that sort of.
Yeah, there's a general pushback about digital ID, and this is not it's not mandatory, but obviously, when you make something that's easy to use, it tends to become kind of de facto mandatory. But um, the government has just kept saying there's not a problem, and they've kept pushing back at us and saying, well, we have data protection, so there's no problem. We already have data accuracy, and we've said, but there are probably 100,000 people who have a different sex recorded in different places. So by the NHS, by the
Yeah.
Passport Authority, by their driving license. And now you're trying to connect all these things together and make them interoperable. You might end up putting red flags up on those people, because they're going to look like they're um, committing fraud,
Yeah. Yeah.
or using the wrong ID, because you're connecting these things together. So the government has kind of pushed it away, and the problem with solving this is you have to solve it across the whole system. But for everybody, they will say, well, I didn't cause this problem. I don't what why should I solve it? And that's what the Secretary of State for Science, who's in charge of this system, has been saying. But if he doesn't solve it, he's going to end up with a system where nobody can prove their sex accurately, and no sex data is reliable because what they'll the way the system will work is that it requires that people use the most accurate data. And so if they say, well, passport data is accurate, then it means people have to take the data that's in the passport ahead of their own eyes, ahead of what they can see. So it really is sort of gender self-ID without legislation. So we've won on the legislative front. We won in the Supreme Court. It's very clear in law what sex means, but in practice, people have what look like reliable documents that are not reliable, and it's very difficult for the police, for social services, for any part of the state to deal with bad information, because they what they need to have is rules that are clear.
What happens if you don't comply to the current Supreme Court ruling? Like if you're a business or maybe NHS or something like that, and you just say, I'm not going to comply. I don't agree with it. I'm not going to comply. What can be done?
So the Equality Act itself, the basic point of the Equality Act is you mustn't discriminate based on the 9 protected characteristics, so sex, race, disability, age, and so on. And if you do, someone can sue you. So that's what I did. I sued on belief. And people tend to sue as employees because, if you lose your job or you're discriminated against at work, that can be big money. I mean, that's a big part of your life. Whereas if you're discriminated at the gym, if you go to the gym and it's a women's changing room, and then there's a trans woman in there and you feel uncomfortable and you leave that gym, it's not such a big part of your life. And so people have tended not to sue on those kinds of cases, and so businesses have got away with it. So I think the first place where compliance is going to um, be made to happen will be in workplaces, because those are the places where one, everyone knows who people are, so it's not a sort of fleeting interaction. The rules are very clear. People have very good incentives to keep their job, keep their pension, and make sure that their rights are upheld. And there's a lot of overlap between workplaces and services. So a hospital, for example, is a workplace, but it's also a service. And if you recognise that your female staff have the right to single sex spaces that are really single sex, then you're also going to end up recognising that in relation to your patients. So I think there will be areas where there's stronger compliance, an area where there's weaker compliance, and then we need to get the regulators to act. So there are a bunch of different regulators. So the Equality and Human Rights Commission regulates the Equality Act, but as I said, the Information Commission regulates data. You have the Care Quality Commission, which regulates the health and social care. If you ask for a female doctor, you should get a female doctor, not a male doctor dressed as a woman. But also, just in general, sex should be recorded accurately in healthcare, or you're going to put people at risk. The Health and Safety Executive is the body that's supposed to regulate all of this health and safety law, and as I said, toilets is part of that. They're a sort of dog that didn't bark so far. The pubs want to keep their license. If a publican thinks that they're at risk of losing their license, they do whatever it takes to stay in compliance. So you shouldn't need to have individuals asserting their rights all the time. I mean, that's the sort of hallmark of being in a society that works, is that you don't have to work really hard to make sure that your food is safe and that your transport's safe, and that electricity works and the water works. All of those things, you kind of expect them to work, and the reason you expect them to work is because you have regulators that work. And on this they haven't. But I think once you start to get areas of compliance, then it's going to be much harder for other bits of the system to stay in non-compliance.
It seems like there is a lot more work than I thought there'd be post the ruling. I thought there'd be. It seems like yeah, the next couple of years have probably got a lot of
Yeah,
a lot of work to do.
yeah.
What's going
We
to be the
we
rest?
drank champagne and then we had one day of drinking champagne and then it was back to work.
I think the healthcare one will be very interesting in terms of what happens there because
And then schools as well.
oh yeah, schools. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean that's going to be another seriously challenging thing. Would it just be easier if everyone just essentially said this is a law now, or if the government, there we go, if the government came out and said this is a ruling, everyone has to abide by it. We don't care how you abide by it, but that's the ruling. Would that?
I think Yeah, I mean, I think they will. I think they will eventually, and because the Equality Act, I mean, one thing people have tried every kind of bad argument since the judgment, and one of them is, oh well, this is very narrow. It's only about the Equality Act. And you're like, well, the Equality Act covers education, employment, service provision, and associations and public services. I mean, that's pretty much the whole economy there. Um, if you get compliance in employment, you're going to get compliance in most places. And this is not about driving trans people out of existence or trying to. I mean, it will make them unhappy because they've been told that their happiness depends on other people, um, uh, affirming them as the wrong sex. Um, but we have to be a society where people can kind of do their own thing, but not expect everyone to fall in line.
Couldn't agree more. It's been amazing to speak to you. It's amazing to get the insights. We have like a closing ritual on the show where I always ask the guest for an unpopular opinion that you have that you think should be popular. So it could be something that we discussed, it could be completely off topic, but yeah, an unpopular opinion that you have that you think should be popular.
Um, I, I think it's that people don't need to have an opinion about everything. Um, is is a people have everyone has to have a thought about everything, and that's part of the problem here. So I think, yeah, I mean, it's partly my safe answer. I've got one very unpopular opinion, and I don't want any others. But I also think that people don't need to have opinions about everything.
I couldn't agree more because I think I think I'm guilty of it. I think so many people because we have so much information at our fingertips now constantly, whether it's Twitter, social media, TV. We think we have so much more knowledge than we do, but we just have information. So I'm
Mm.
very quick to form opinions on stuff that we have a lot of information, but we actually have no knowledge on. And I think it's a really, again, maybe it's more of a millennial, that generation kind of problem because, yeah, I think it's definitely something I've definitely noticed a lot of. But yeah, thank you so much for your time. It's been amazing speaking to you.
Thank you for having me on.